Former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh making comments about the relationship between the central bank and the Treasury. Eamon Javers has got the details on this one. Eamon.
Hey there, Melissa. This coming from Reuters reporting of a Kevin Warsh speech at a conference here in D.C. earlier today. This is interesting because of the timing of all this in the context of President Trump's criticism of Jay Powell and these questions of will he or won't he in terms of attempting to fire Jay Powell. Kevin Warsh at this conference very critical of the Fed, saying that he believes in the operational independence of the Fed. According to Reuters, Warsh told a conference today that the Fed has gone beyond its remit and undermined its own claims to independence. He urged the Fed to stop relying on data dependence to guide its decisions, and he blamed the central bank for aiding the expansion of the U.S. national debt and for allowing inflation to surge after the pandemic. So this is similar in tone, Melissa, to some of the criticisms that Warsh has made before. But the whole context here is that Warsh is seen by a lot of folks as the potential Trump nominee for Fed chair at some point after Jay Powell his term is over next year, or if something happens between now and then, more immediately than that. And so the question here is Kevin Warsh making these comments because these are his standard criticisms of the Fed, or is he making these comments now because he's sort of lobbying for the job? One big asterisk to all this, although there has been a lot of discussion about whether Trump will or will not try to fire Jay Powell before his term is up next year, I asked the president in the Oval Office earlier this week if he believes he has the power to fire Jay Powell. And the president said, I don't want to even get into that because I have no intention of firing Jay Powell. So the current line from the White House is the president doesn't intend to fire Powell, but clearly Warsh is the man in the wings. And so a lot of attention being paid to what he has to say.
I mean, it does sound like an audition for a job, Eamon. In terms of not relying on data dependence, has he said either in these comments or in past comments what then the Fed should rely on? Because if it's not data...
Boy, I wish we had Steve Leisman here for this, because
he is an encyclopedia of
all the Fed speakers, and we're a little bit out of my area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, he has been critical of the Fed before on these issues of U.S. debt and the policy post-pandemic. And then the question is, is he doing this just because, look, there's a lot of finance ministers in Washington this week. The IMF is here. There are a lot of folks making speeches at a lot of conferences in financial Washington this week. Or is this timed to sort of dovetail with the president's criticisms of Jay Powell? And so that political timing, I think, is the thing that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows.
I'm just too used to you having all the answers, Eamon. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Eamon, thank you as always.
Get Steve on the line. He's the expert.
All right. Eamon Javers reporting from Washington. What would we make of a Fed chair, Kevin Warsh?
Yeah, I think he's for lower rates. And I think what Warsh had said was not solely on data, not solely on the data points that the Fed is worried about market valuations, worried about asset prices, include those all in, not just data dependency. So I think, to be not fair to him, but I think that's what his view is. And obviously he would toe the line for the administration. And you said this sounds like an audition. We already know who's going to be the next, he'll be the next Fed chair when it happens.
So, I mean, I think he would be, he's a very good choice, I think. He's a very smart guy. I think what happened, though, the last time that the Fed ignored data and thought things were transitory, right, instead of ignoring that data and saying, well, it's not going to be like that, that ended up being an enormous mistake. And so you can understand why they would be hesitant to do that again.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, too, when it comes to the Fed, we saw this back in the fall where they started lowering rates, but the bond market just did the opposite. And I think to a certain extent, we can see those policy changes, but the markets are also going to do something different. I think that is something we want to continue to watch is what are the bond markets telling us? Because that's been much more indicative, especially over the last 6 months, of where things are going. And so that's what I would continue to watch, especially with all this arguing on Capitol Hill right now.
But what was interesting about just what we went through here with Eamon is that these headlines seem to be coming out in the context also of the Treasury. I didn't really understand what those headlines were saying, because again, the independence, obviously the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, very, very different functions, but obviously the Treasury certainly has, there's a lot of interplay ultimately in what the Treasury is doing based upon what the Fed does. The other confusion really could be with headlines that talk about data dependence, and all we've been doing is talking about an independent Fed. And ultimately, what is the Fed going to make their decisions based upon? And there's been some concern that some of the folks that are compiling a lot of the data and some of these independent sources that actually are, this is what they do, are no longer doing what they do because they've actually been cut loose. So, I mean, there's different dynamics here. I agree with what everybody here is saying. Is Kevin Warsh, I think, brings a lot of continuity, and I think most people are not concerned about that. Yeah. But that these headlines are such that I do think it's easy to make some headlines here.